Hey everyone, how is it going? Luke here. Imagine you open raising the cutoff and the button is cold calling you. Now the small blind comes in for the squeeze and the action folds to you. Have you ever looked into how often you are supposed to fold here versus calling and four betting? And what would you do with a hand like King Queen Jack 9 single suited? Or Queen Queen 10 7 single suited? And what about a hand like Jack 10 8 5 double suited? Are these folds for you? Or are you standardly calling them? Or maybe even four betting? What if I told you that these hands are all supposed to be a fold here? We're supposed to play very tight here and play a very narrow and well-defined range versus a squeeze at low stakes. And this is exactly the topic of today's lesson. We're looking into open raising from the cutoff where the button is cold calling and the small blind is squeezing you. How are we supposed to continue here facing a squeeze? Welcome to a new episode of the crushing small stakes PLO course. Let's kick things off by looking into the tendencies here. So if we sit in the cutoff here versus a small blind squeeze, in a GTO simulation, we are supposed to fold 60% of our hands here. We're only calling 28% of the time here and four betting 12%. So we have a very, very high fold frequency. However, if we look into how most players are actually playing, we can see very different numbers. First of all, the fold frequency is much lower. It's only 28%. And the call frequency is much higher, 57%. While the four betting frequency remains very, very similar, around 13% of the time. Now let's compare the stakes that we are actually playing. So first of all, we're playing low stakes. Let's say PLO 50. That's what the course and the simulation here is built on. At low stakes, as I told you, we're folding 60% of the time. That's what we are supposed to do. However, if we start playing higher stakes, for example, mid stakes, the fold frequency here versus a squeeze drops to 40%. And at high stakes, the fold frequency drops to 32% only. So rake has a massive impact here because all the other parameters running the simulation are exactly the same and only the rake levels are different. And you can see here how massively the difference is playing low stakes versus mid stakes and versus high stakes. So if you're currently playing low stakes PLO, it's very important to pay close attention to this and not simply call similar hands you see other players calling at higher stakes. So pay attention to this exact situation. Now, what are some of the principles that we have to keep in mind here when we are facing a squeeze here? We're looking into a 100 big blind situation. First of all, you should always forward aces at 100 big blind in this situation. Secondly, Broadway pairs need a lot of additional components to continue here. Don't overvalue double-suited, semi-connected rundowns. And lastly, single-suited rundowns are folded very, very often. And we're going to look into each one of these individually. And at the end of this video, we'll also look at some of the four-betting candidates. First of all, let's kick things off by looking into the Broadway single-suited pairs. There are some notes on the left side first to start off with. We're folding 67% of all these combinations. So imagine you open raising the cutoff with any of the Broadway pairs that is single suited. You face a squeeze and now you're supposed to fold 67% of the time. It is a massive number. You should focus on a lot of connectivity and focus on often also having a suited ace and a chance to block aces there. Let's look into some hands that we are supposed to continue with by calling. Hands like King King 6-5 or King Queen Queen 9. Like these are high pairs. Kings and queens are folded less often in this scenario than, for example, jacks and tens because they are simply stronger hands. Now, in addition to that, we still need to have some form of connectivity or high suit value. So, for example, King King 6-5 with a low suit would be a fold in this scenario. King Queen Queen 9 here is connected enough, and it also has a high suit and a high pair. So this hand is good enough to continue with by calling. A hand like Ace Jack Jack Deuce is a call because we have the nut suit. There is some form of connectivity still, but especially having that ace high suit here is very, very important. And without the ace high suit, it would be a fold. The lower the pair gets, the more important connectivity becomes. So for example, with tens, you cannot call tens with like 2 gaps or 3 gaps in there. You should focus on very strong connectivity the weaker your pair becomes. So 10-10-9-8 is strong enough here to continue with. So these are some examples of hands you can call with, but recognize and pay close attention to the fact that many of the weaker combos like this are supposed to be a fold here. And it's important for you to jump into this and check out yourself, like what hands are you actually calling here that you are actually supposed to fold. Let's continue. Look into 2 Broadway plus 2 non-Broadway cards. These hands are double suited in this scenario that we open, raise, and the cutoff. We're 50% of the time supposed to fold here. And here it's very, very important to have the ace, actually. If we have the ace, we have a very low fold frequency, only 20%. But if we don't have the ace, the fold frequency goes up to 81% of the time. Let's look at some examples here. Hands like King 10-8-7 and King Jack 9-7. Like these hands are good enough to call with. They have enough connectivity, they are double suited, and they are strongly connected, as I told you. So these hands are actually supposed to call, but the more gappy these type of hands become, and the lower the side cards get here, the more often you should actually supposed to fold. So these are already some of the borderline hands, and at the bottom of our calling range here. If we have an ace, as I told you, we can continue much more often, 80% of the time. And some of the bottom hands that we can call with are ace jack 3-4 and ace 10-5-4 double suited. Like here, obviously we have the ace high suit. A lot of value can come from that, of course, by dominating lower flush draws. There is still some connectivity, of course, and we have 2 suits. So the ace here is a very important asset. Now let's continue with rundowns. Single suited rundowns with 0, 1, or 2 gap, which is one of the categories of hands that we are using here in the low stakes course, if you have paid attention to our 18 categories. Now notes on this specific category of hands, 61% folding. We should focus on having a suited ace with 3 Broadway cards. We should focus on perfect or near perfect connectors, and low rundowns in this specific situation do actually quite well. So a hand like ace queen jack 10 here is obviously good enough to continue. I'm pretty sure most of you will, but imagine that weaker combos like this with lower side, with more disconnectivity basically, are supposed to be a fold very often. Let's look into another example. King Jack 10-9 single suited. Again, good connectivity, only 1 gap. We have a king high suit. This hand is good enough to continue with here. Hands like 10-8-7-6 single suited and 7-6-5-4 double suited, single suited play also very well here. Especially the 7-6-5-4 single suited is an interesting combo because we often play a part of the board that is not very well represented in our opponent's ranges. So the squeezing range is obviously focused on high pairs and high rundowns very often, and also the cold calling range on the button is very often focused on, for example, the high pairs. So a low rundown doesn't do that poorly here, because we are often, if we hit a piece of the board, we do very, very well here. And we have also easy decisions if the cards on the board become very high, where we can easily fold. So those hands do pretty well here and should be called. But recognize again that getting more gaps in these hands, the hands should mainly be a fold here very, very often. So don't overvalue these rundowns with like 2 gaps that are single suited very often. Let's finally look into our 4-betting strategy here. So far we have learned that we should have a very tight calling strategy facing a squeeze here, that we should have a very high fold frequency. When it comes to 4-betting in this scenario, we know that we should always 4-bet aces. However, there are some groups of hands that we can also potentially 4-bet here. These are double suited rundowns and high pairs that have an ace blocker. Now let's look into some of these examples. A hand like ace 10-9-8 double suited is a great addition into our 4-betting range here. We're blocking aces, we're double suited, and we are flopping very, very smooth on very many flops here. And this hand is a great addition to our 4-betting strategy. Another candidate is 10-9-7-6 double suited. Now this hand is also an interesting one. Double suited rundowns that are not perfectly connected but have like 1 or 2 gaps and that are somewhat medium high. So we look here often at Jack, 10, and sometimes 9 high rundowns with like 1 gap in there, sometimes 2. Like these hands are capable of 4-bet bluffing. We unblock kings and queens, so we can make our opponent fold those candidates of hands. And if the money would go in against aces, these hands don't do as bad as, for example, higher pairs or higher rundowns, because those are much more often more heavily dominated there. These hands simply perform better against an ace-ace heavy range. Focus on the fact that these hands do have a gap. If we wouldn't have a gap, for example, 10-9-8, 10-9-8, 7 double suited, we should always call here. These hands have a too much high of an EV by calling, and the playability when we call there is simply too good to turn this hand into a semi-bluff by choosing to 4-bet. We rather 4-bet hands that don't flop as smoothly, for example with 1 or 2 gaps, and turn those hands into a semi-bluff instead of calling there. The best ones with no gaps are simply too good, and we should just call those. Now, obviously, a side note here is to make that some of the value for betting these hands comes from the fact that we are supposed to make our opponent fold kings and queens that he is squeezing there. However, if our opponent is not capable of doing that, the value of 4-betting here drops, and we should ask ourselves the question whether or not we actually want to use them as a 4-bet. So make sure to always keep that in mind and not automatically always 4-bet these candidates. Sometimes it's better to just call those combinations, and sometimes it's better to use them as a 4-bet bluff. So you should play around a little bit with it and also think about it in-game and make the best decision possible at that moment. We cannot simply always use a GTO outcome and simply implement it, because our opponent uses a different strategy than the GTO models recommend. Finally, high pairs with an ace blocker, hands like ace king king 10, single suited, and ace queen queen deuce double suited are great additions to our 4-betting range. These hands perform very well against a squeezing range that is a GTO recommended. However, if our opponent is not squeezing as wide as he should from a GTO model, but he's squeezing somewhat tighter and is more heavily leaning towards aces, these hands shouldn't be used as a 4-bet here. Only 4-bet here if your opponent is capable of squeezing a wide range of hands. But if he is somewhat tighter, these hands don't perform as well, because we're more often up against aces, and these hands in particularly do very bad against aces, of course, because we have a pair ourselves in our hand. And we will be dominated very, very much. So if our opponent is squeezing on the tighter end, only focus on 4-betting aces. And in addition to that, we can use some of the double-suited rundowns that you can see on the left. If your opponent is a regular and is capable of squeezing some of basically the hands that he should squeeze here, then a hand like ace king king 10 and high pairs with an ace blocker that are double-suited, like ace queen queen deuce, are great additions there. They have a lot of value in 4-betting. We block aces, and they are often the best hand at that point. So I hope you enjoyed this video. We spoke about facing a squeeze, the fact that we should be tight, fold a lot, and that the differences between being at low stakes, playing mid stakes, and high stakes is fairly big here. I wish you all the best next week in the poker games that you are going to play. And I would also recommend you to jump into our software and check out this specific situation and learn more about what groups of hands have a very high fold frequency, which are capable of calling, what can be some of our 4-bet bluffing hands, and get a good understanding of this specific situation, because many of us are calling too much. Even if you're not calling 60% as many of the people in the population are doing, but it's very likely that you're still in between GTO numbers and population tendency numbers, and you should aim towards coming closer to those GTO frequencies. With that being said, all the best. I'll see you next week. Over and out. This was Luuk for the PLO Mastermind.